about 5 seconds. You can just go ahead, Ken.
Okay. Now?
Yep.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of this important public conversation sponsored by the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights on critical race theory. I am Ken Clark, Director of Human Rights for Tompkins County. Critical race theory, or CRT, is one of the most talked about and yet most misunderstood topics in American society, politics, and culture. Tonight's program is a continuation of the discussion on CRT that we began on March 29th when 2 outstanding legal scholars clarified what CRT is and is not. Professor Cedric Powell of the Louis D. Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville, and Professor Etienne Toussaint of the University of South Carolina Law School. Tonight, we are joined by another prominent and prolific scholar who will share his perspective on this hotbed topic. I will introduce him shortly. CRT originated in the 1980s as an interdisciplinary field in law schools. It was created by Kimberly Crenshaw, who majored in Africana Studies at Cornell in the 1970s as an undergraduate, Neil Gatanda and Stephanie Phillips. CRT is an analytical tool which, in Crenshaw's words, explores how racial inequality was historically structured into the fabric of the American Republic, mirrored by law, insulated by the founding Constitution, and embedded into the infrastructure of American society. CRT is not taught in public schools. Those who oppose curricular training and readings in public schools used to examine the history and contemporary reality of American racism have conflated CRT with such activities. CRT is not taught in diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, reading and discussion groups, in places of employment. It may inform anti-racist writing and activism, but is not typically the framework used by these writers and activists. CRT in the public sphere has become weaponized, used as a cudgel in the hands of politicians, parents, and pundits to demolish any educational initiative that insists on an honest reckoning with America's racist past and present. EdWeek.org reports that since January 2021, 42 states have introduced bills or taken other steps that would restrict teaching critical race theory or limit how teachers can discuss racism and sexism, according to an Education Week analysis. 15 states have imposed these bans and restrictions either through legislation or other avenues. CRT has been labeled as divisive, blamed for teaching white children to feel bad about themselves, promoting anti-white hatred and indoctrination. Professor Crenshaw draws parallels in a Los Angeles Times opinion piece written in January between the so-called anti-CRT movement and the massive resistance of the civil rights era in opposition to the 1954 Supreme Court decision, which ruled public school segregation as unconstitutional. Properly understood, critical race theory is necessary because of the incapacity of what Crenshaw called an enduring faction of American society that has long resisted any examination of racism that identifies and exposes its structural and institutional character. To further explore both the facts and the fictions related to CRT, we're joined tonight by Professor Gregory S. Parks, Associate Dean for Strategic Initiatives, Wake Forest University School of Law. I have known Professor Parks from his days as a student at Cornell Law School, from where he graduated in 2008. His scholarship and research engage the intersections of race, law, and social sciences. He has utilized cognitive and social psychology to examine what implicit attitudes and biases signify for law. He also explores the networks of Black fraternities and sororities and their relationship to the law, particularly the role that attorneys and judges who are lifelong members of these organizations played in the in the founding and in the ongoing work of these organizations. The role of these organizations in the African American quest for freedom, and the legal issues related to hazing in these organizations. Author, co-author, or editor of 10 books and numerous articles in scholarly and popular print. He will now engage us on critical race theory, fact v. fiction. Professor Parks. I should say before he begins, after Professor Parks' presentation, we will welcome questions from the audience, which we ask you to submit through the YouTube chat.
Thank you, Reverend Clark. It's a pleasure to be with you and your guests in the Tompkins County community, having resided there for several years, well over 12 years ago. And in light of that, it's appropriate to start where it all began. I started law school in 2005 at Cornell. And after I got through with my first year curriculum, which is a set curriculum for all students, what I found myself doing with some regularity is taking courses where I could write papers and often converting those papers into scholarly articles. One paper that I wrote, which was my student note for the Cornell Journal of Law and Public Policy, published in volume 17, issue number 3, summer of 2008, was an article titled "Toward a Critical Race Realism." That title also is used for a book title, co-edited with my current colleague, Jonathan Carty, here at Wake Forest, and a good friend and former colleague, Shane Jones, a criminologist at a university in Texas, which is an edited volume published by the New Press. And in that article, or more appropriately, a student note, I lay out in part the history, the intellectual history of critical race theory, and tee up what I call critical race realism, which I'll talk about shortly. If you'll allow me, I'll largely take excerpts from the student note, because I think that it lays out well the intellectual history of what gets us to critical race theory, and then tackle some of the more contemporary debate about CRT. So in order to understand critical race theory from my perspective, you've got to understand American legal education starting at its roots. So the predominant law school, as one might imagine, Harvard Law School, at the end of the 19th century going into the 20th century. Harvard is credited with establishing the first modern American law school. From 1870 to 1895, Christopher Columbus Langdell served as its dean. During his deanship, Harvard Law School shaped the early structure and content of other American law schools. The dominant approach to legal education was the Socratic method, asking students questions, expecting them to answer. And the overriding philosophy at the time, which I think colleague Etienne Toussaint described in part one of this discussion on CRT, was legal formalism. Legal formalism assumed that there were truths out there in the law, and that they emerged largely in judicial opinion, and that, or statutes or constitutional provisions, that with each new case, with each new set of facts, judge would just go find these truths, apply them in almost mathematical-like formula to the new set of facts, so that there should be continuity from case to case. In 1869, Yale Law School permitted students to enroll in other departmental courses such as political science, economics, English, history, and ethics. In addition, from 1874 onward, Yale Law School attempted to develop a broad curriculum that included courses with an interdisciplinary flavor. As we see, Yale took a slightly different trajectory than Harvard Law School, embracing an interdisciplinary approach, different modes of thinking, which created fertile ground for a legal philosophical movement that would emerge from Yale and Columbia law schools a generation or two later, which I'll come to momentarily. So one, we've got to think about the place of these two different law schools, Harvard Law School on one hand, its philosophical approach, Yale Law School on the other hand, and its philosophical approach. We also got to think about leading individuals of the day at the turn of the 20th century who shaped how we think about the law, in part moving us from legal formalism to a new philosophy, which I'll come to shortly. Among these men were U.S. Supreme Court Justices Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., Louis Brandeis, Judge Benjamin Cardozo, as well as, ironically, Harvard Law School Dean Roscoe Pound. Each man served as a forefather to what would become known as legal realism, an area of jurisprudence or legal philosophy that dominated the mid-20th century and still reverberates today, even in how we think about critical race theory. So just a little highlight about each of these men. Holmes highlighted the real-world aspect of the law when he noted that the life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. He also emphasized how extra legal factors, those factors outside the law, had a tremendous bearing on the law. Whether it was as he said, the felt necessities of time, prevalent moral and political theories, intuitions of public policy, vowed or unconscious, or the prejudices which judges share with their fellow men, law was at least in part governed by factors that fell outside the law. Brandeis was the first lawyer to employ social science data in litigation. Part of a strategy aimed towards defending social policy against constitutional attack. In Muller v. Oregon, a 1908 U.S. Supreme Court decision, he used statistics to support his claim that long work hours were dangerous to the health of women and ultimately to our communities. Cardozo was the first to speak to the various modes of judicial thinking that were not wholly consistent with traditional logic. He theorized that there were four approaches to judicial decision-making: philosophy, evolution, traditions, and sociology. Philosophical approach was analogous to adherence to legal precedent. The evolutionary approach emphasized the historical development of a field of law. The traditional approach referred to community customs. And to Cardozo, the sociological approach was the gap filling, insofar as he believed the judge should employ the law as a means to an end for the good of the collective body. And then lastly, you had Roscoe Pound. He believed in an interdisciplinary approach to understanding the law. In 1905, he called for a philosophy of law founded on social and political science. He urged scholars not simply to study law on the books, but to look at law in action, meaning judges write down a lot of stuff in opinions. What really matters is how law affects people, influences people in their daily lives. So, early part of the 20th century, around 1920, you had Thomas Swan, dean of Yale Law School. 1916 of that year, he proposed to Yale's president the law school should expand into a Yale School of Law and jurisprudence being legal philosophy. And in time, what emerged was legal realism. Legal realism was not a monolithic school of thought. There were broadly three types of legal realists. Number one and number three are what I think influenced down the road critical race theorists. One, critical oppositional variant, sought to expose the contradictions in classical legal formalism, that law really isn't simply legal rules applied blindly and dispassionately to a new set of facts, like a mathematical formula, and you get similar results every time. Number two, the social scientific variant that employed the insights and methods of the empirical sciences. And then three, practical political variant that designed, made, and enforced reform policies. Realist jurisprudence was most appropriately known as functionalism, juxtaposed to formalism, an attempt to understand law in terms of its factual context, economic and social consequences, hearkening back to Roscoe Pound's notion that we need to be less concerned with law in books, more concerned with law's impact on people in their daily lives. Realist jurisprudence, known as functionalism, was an attempt to understand law in terms of its factual context, as I note, and economic and social consequences. Quite possibly, the major contribution of the realists was to undermine Langdell's idea that the law was an exact science based on objective black letter rules. Think about this. There's a statute that says no cars in the park. Now, what does that really mean? To a formalist, what it means is there are no vehicles allowed in the park, no remote control cars allowed in the park, there are no people with the last name car allowed in the park, there are no, and people are not allowed to paint paintings of cars while in the park. A realist would say that's preposterous. What is the goal seeking that the legislators sought to effectuate with this legislative enactment? Presumably noise and air pollution. And if that's the case, it's just automobiles. So it's a deeper dive, greater contemplation on what the goal is for a law and translating laws into public policy. The realists featured two distinctive methodological approaches. The first approach was debunking, a method that subjected questionable judicial opinions to logical analysis in order to expose their inconsistencies, substantiated premises, and tendency to pass off contingent judgments as inexorable. You see this reverberate to today in critical race theory. Most of the canonical realists, like adherents of other progressive reform movements, avoided the hot racial issues of the day. However, they did tackle race issues in two ways. First, a few realist thinkers directly addressed the race question. Carl Llewellyn, Morris Cohen, Robert Hale attempted to create a realist critique of American race relations. Llewellyn actively supported the NAACP during the 1920s and 1930s and was a self-proclaimed opponent of racial segregation. The NAACP board of directors even asked him at one point to lead their legal committee. The second way that legal realism touched upon race issues was in the form of a particular man, and that man is Charles Hamilton Houston. He was the architect of the NAACP strategy to end racial segregation, particularly in public education. And he was certainly a realist, even if he didn't describe himself as such. He provided a model for how to employ social science to effectuate change in laws bearing on racial equality. He also articulated a model for how to change racial policy and how both an academic and a practitioner could employ those means, which again reverberates to this day in critical race theory. As such, he embraced the legal realist ethos. While attending Harvard Law School, Houston was a student of realists such as Roscoe Pound and Felix Frankfurter. In fact, Felix Frankfurter was Houston's advisor. Houston believed that a lawyer was either a social engineer or a parasite on society. He defined a social engineer as a highly skilled, perceptive, sensitive lawyer who understands the United States Constitution, knows how to employ it to solve local problems and to better underprivileged citizens' conditions, right? So again, Houston went on to become the dean of Howard University Law School. He was the mentor and professor of legal giants like Thurgood Marshall. And again, his philosophy was that a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. Either you are an individual who's highly skilled, perceptive, sensitive to the needs of the community, who uses the Constitution to advance the needs of the community, or you're just somebody out here trying to get paid off your clients without really caring about the needs, especially of those who are underprivileged. So then, towards the tail end of the legal realist movement, at Yale you had the policy science movement by Myers, McDougall, and Harold Laswell in the 30s. I won't spend much time saying anything about that. After that, you had the Yale's Divisional Studies program. Again, deep into the 20th century, Yale was playing a significant role in thinking about law from a very different perspective vis-a-vis formalism. And then you shift to the law and movement, which I know Professor Toussaint spoke of in the first iteration of this webinar series. The first law and movement was law and economic movements that has roots that are centuries old. But in 1937, the Chicago Law School, or now University of Chicago Law School, developed an optional 4-year curriculum, part of which was reorganized to explore law and law's social working. This area, law and economics, focused on the notion that law should be economically efficient. Not surprisingly, the law and econ movement is a very conservative movement, has its roots at the University of Chicago Law School, but also spread to other law schools like George Mason Law School. On the other side of the continuum, where CRT emerges from, is the law and society movement. In 1964, Harry Ball, coordinator of the University of Wisconsin Sociology and Law program, took the lead in advancing what would come to be known as the Law and Society movement. The Law and Society Association was used as a forum to promote the rigorous interdisciplinary study of the law. David Trubeck, who was a professor at the time, describes 5 types of law and society actors. True scientist was a scientist who wanted to study the law. Social problem solver was a scientist with a social mission to participate in social reform. The technician, for example, statisticians and survey researchers, simply provided technical skills to an expanding field of legal studies. The imperial jurist leads social science would supplant legal doctrine and help the law understand its own powers and limitations. And then lastly, the skeptical pragmatist, not believe social science would replace legal studies, but viewed it as a useful way to understand the legal process. Then we move from the law and society movement to the critical legal studies movement, the immediate parent of critical race theory. Critical legal studies emerged as one of the leading jurisprudential schools in the second half of the 1970s to the 1980s. In 1976, Duncan Kennedy and David Trubeck, both law professors, met and discerned that there were a number of legal scholars around the country engaged in similar scholarship. They decided to convene these individuals. Mark Tushnet, then the dean of the University of Wisconsin Law School, organized an academic conference. Many of these early critical legal studies scholars met at, where else? They met at Yale. Some of the critical legal studies founders were formerly active in the law society movement. However, they ultimately disagreed with the Law and Society colleagues on certain key issues. One of the factors was that cleaved this group from the Law and Society movement was that there was this debate about the importance of empirical social science, which also comes up in how we think about critical race theory. David Trubeck suggested that empirical research legitimates the status quo, that it implies that research facts were objectively there, quote unquote. Second, he argued that a scholar could not separate ideology from methodology, any type of research, including empirical research. So while critical legal studies is a direct extension of legal realism, it is largely so through deconstruction of legal opinions and doctrine, harkening back to legal realism. Critical legal studies differs from legal realism in two ways. As noted, while critical legal studies scholars had little faith in social science, the realists endorsed social science with alacrity. Additionally, ethical relativism, endorsed by most critical legal studies scholars, was different from and more coherent than that of the legal realists. Thus, critical legal studies has become associated with particular politically left-leaning law faculty based on three propositions. First, law is indeterminate. Second, law is more accurately understood by paying attention to the context in which it is made. And third, law is simply politics. Something that, current Supreme Court Chief Justice Roberts says that a judge's job is to call balls and strikes. Critics say that's not what a judge is doing. It's politics. So then we get to critical race theory. So the cleavage in critical race theory from critical legal studies may have been, as described by Richard Delgado, one of the founding fathers of CRT, an inevitable result of the different worldviews of whites and people of color. For example, many whites do not readily perceive racism. People of color, on the other hand, see and are on the receiving end of racism daily. This has two effects. First, even the most sympathetic, left-leaning whites have to constantly be re-educated about racism. Second, it colors each group's legal and political theorizing, causing members of the respective groups to take different stances on issues, simply because of the racial categories that they fall in. As such, whites and people of color within the critical legal studies movement had fundamental differences in what they wanted in a legal theory. In 1985, the 1985 Critical Legal Studies Conference was organized by its feminist wing, the FemCrit. Women of color were called upon to discuss how they wanted to participate in that conference. Several invitees noted how they might discuss race at the conference, which resulted in a racism workshop. The question that launched the workshop was, what is it about the whiteness of CLS that keeps the people of color at bay? Such a question was not well received by the white male heavies of the CLS movement. Two additional events drove people of color from the ranks of CLS. First, during a visit at Stanford University Law School, white students complained about Derek Bells, who was like the founding father of CRT. They complained about his approach to teaching constitutional law and arranged a series of supplemental lectures that other faculty, white faculty, might provide them outside of Professor Bell's class. Given that Stanford was seen as a CLS stronghold, people of color within CLS were gravely concerned. Second, there was a racial stereotype about Mexicans that had been published in the CLS newsletter, The Lizard. So at the 1987 CLS conference, attendees hosted a panel entitled The Minority Critique of CLS Scholarship and Silence on Race. Analysts focused their comments on the racially specific culture of CLS, the critique of rights, and on the silencing of voices of color in the legal academy. In 1988, Kimberly Crenshaw, as noted by Rev Clark, Stephanie Phillips, and Richard Delgado, began discussions on how to convene individuals interested in the intersection of CLS and race. At that time, Crenshaw was a visiting fellow, Phillips was a Hasty fellow, and Delgado was a professor. Together, they approached David Trubeck, director of the Wisconsin Institute of Legal Studies, for funds to support a workshop initially called the New Developments in Race and Legal Theory, but ultimately changed the name of the conference to Critical Race Theory. So on July 8, 1989, 24 Critical Race Theory workshop participants gathered in Madison, Wisconsin. They defined CRT as a race-based systemic critique of legal reasoning and legal institutions. However, they created an area of jurisprudence, of legal philosophy, that was more than just theory. Critical race theory, in addition to being critical, is in part an activist agenda, as it both tries to understand the plight of racial minorities and, two, to change that plight. Delgado and Jean Stefancic, his wife, also a CRT scholar, indicate that critical race theory has three basic tenets, and I'll elaborate on these shortly. First, racism is normal in the way society operates and the common experience of people of color in the United States, meaning that racism is embedded within every institution. It's in the air that we breathe, the water that we drink. Second, white over color dominance serves an important psychic and physical purpose, mainly for white people. And so arguably race has no biological roots, but it has psychological value. And that's why it's propagated in advance. And then third, the concept of race is a social construction, which it flows from the last statement, the product of people's thoughts and relations. So at a high level, so that's the context for understanding how we get to CRT from earlier movements. And I don't doubt that my colleague, Etienne Toussaint, laid out the connections with critical studies. And I also recognize that my colleague, Cedric Powell, laid out some of the basic tenets of CRT. But at a high level, here are some of them. One is, as stated, race is a social construction. There is no biological basis for race. Two, and connected with one, is that there is psychological value to race, meaning that there's value in a society if you are in a group that is cast as on a higher tier than another group. And groups will fight to ensure to get that power and to maintain that power. And three, again, that racism is embedded within the institutions in America. And as a consequence, it matters little whether an individual is racist, because whether or not they are, the system is set up to advantage whites on average, disadvantage people of color. So let me talk a little bit about high level, some of the other elements of CRT. One is a critique of liberalism and concepts that flow from liberalism, like affirmative action and colorblindness and merit. A critical race theorist would push back against these notions in some respects and say, there's no such thing as merit or colorblindness. People are influenced by race, whether they will admit it or not, meaning that they're constantly aware of it, but sometimes there's social sanctions because they acknowledge it, so they won't. Or quite often, they don't even know that they're influenced by race, right? So this is our discussion of implicit bias. The notion of merit is nonsensical because quite often people are advanced non-meritorious reasons, consciously or subconsciously, in ways that race influences it. But when the legal system makes a concerted effort to advance certain disadvantaged groups or historically disadvantaged groups based on race, then the question of merit comes up, only then. Additionally, storytelling is a dominant strand of CRT methodology. So unlike its roots in legal realism or the law and society movement, more like critical legal studies, CRT doesn't fully embrace the use of social science and empiricism. Rather, it historically has seen storytelling as a valuable methodology because storytelling allows people of color, Black people in particular, to resituate themselves within this American narrative on their own terms. As an aside, what I'll say is in the past, I'd say 8 to 10 years, there has been an aggressive movement amongst members of the critical race theory movement to embrace and employ empirical social science in advancing CRT doctrine. Also, the notion of intersectionality is that quite often what happens is people are discriminated against based upon the intersection nature of their marginalized identities. So for example, a Black woman may be treated in the workspace differently than other women and men, even Black men, right? There's something unique about the intersection of marginalized identities that you don't see when you simply have those marginalized identities scrutinized in isolation from one another. Essentialism raises the question of what does it really mean to be Black? Are the experiences of African Blacks whose ancestors were brought here in the hulls of slave ships, same as Africans or brothers and sisters from the Caribbean who immigrated here a generation ago, a year ago? Interest convergence is the notion that Black advancement is predicated upon white elites embracing those methods and those goals. And until white elites embrace those methods and those goals, there can be no Black advancement. And then the last thing I'll say is, and this harkens back to the first point, is that racism is systemic in the United States. Again, it doesn't matter if one individual is a racist. What's more problematic is if the educational system, the religious system, the legal system, if they all embrace and are infused with racial bias, then it makes it more difficult for Black and racial minority advancement. And the last thing I'll say on the tenets would be something Derek Bell noted, that racism is permanent in America, that it ain't going nowhere. But importantly, give me 1 second, because I'm going to look something up. It's a poem. I don't have it memorized. You may know it, Reverend Clark. Claude McKay.
Oh, if we must die. Yes.
Harlem Renaissance poet Claude McKay. Whenever I've read this poem, I think of Derek Bell's notion of the permanence of racism in America, and yet how Black folks must respond. Claude McKay writes, if we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave. And for their 1,000 blows, deal one death blow. And for their what though before us lies the open grave. Like men will face the murderous, cowardly tack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. In essence, that's Derek Bell's philosophy on that point, right? Racism isn't going anywhere. But freedom-loving people in America have a duty, despite that fact, to fight against racism. So let me offer a few comments about modern hysteria around CRT. I hadn't taught critical race theory in several years at Wake Forest Law School. I was scheduled to teach, I think, conflict of laws. And given the tenor and tone that was out there on the political right and in the media, I canceled that class last semester, and then I picked up CRT because I thought it was imperative to teach it. So the first week or so, these are the things that we grappled with in class. What is driving the modern hysteria? One is, I think, because we see tremendous demographic shifts in the growth of people of color who vote. And there are many tactics. Like I said, people with power, they want to hold on to power. And so how do you hold on to power when the numbers just don't add up for you and your constituents? One, you undermine those who are likely to vote against you ability to vote. And two, you find ways to mobilize those who you think will vote for you, which means a few different things. Second point related to the first point is that the best predictor of how people vote is in partisan elections is simply what party they're in. A person may recognize that a candidate from their party is not going to advance a policy that constituent finds favorable to them and their family and their community. But nonetheless, they're still more likely to vote for that candidate over the candidate from another party who has policies that they're promoting to benefit that constituent, their family, and their community, because people just want to vote for the person from their party. The second best predictor of how people vote is based on strong emotion. Strongest emotion, we would hope, is love, but it's not. In politics, it's fear. So if a politician can get you to fear those on the other side of the aisle, they're in a better position to capture your vote than the other party or the other candidate who you fear. And one thing I think that the political right realizes is shifting demographics in this country and the potential for racial equality creates anxiety amongst at least a significant portion of their constituency. And so the way to mobilize that constituency is, there used to be a book published, I think, in the 1970s titled, "Look Out, Whitey, Black Power is Coming to Get Your Mama." And the
Julius
title
Lester.
of that, what'd you say?
Julius Lester.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That makes me think of how the political right has used CRT. To Reverend Clark's point, even though it's not taught in K through 12, not taught in undergraduate institutions, it's not taught in most doctoral programs, it's not even taught in most law schools. It's not taught to first-year law students. Usually what it is an upper-level elective in some law schools and in some doctoral programs in education. So if we were to remix Julius Lester's book title for the political right, this period has been "Watch Out, Whitey, Critical Race Theory is Coming to Get Your Kids."
Mm-hmm.
And so part of that, I think, especially in the age of Donald Trump, especially in the last presidential race when the GOP did not endorse a specific platform, they were running on sheer emotion, right? And I think their lack of a clear message on policy issues that affect all Americans, and even those that may uniquely impact their constituents, I think they don't think they have a coherent message, so they've resorted to fear tactics. The last thing I'll say on this point is there's a difference in America and how patriotic Americans think about patriotism. There are those who engage in constructive patriotism, which means that they engage in an honest assessment of America to recognize the blemishes that it has so that we can collectively correct those blemishes. And that tends to be the predominant approach of the political left. And then on the political right, it's more of a blind patriotism. It is a lack of recognition or desire to recognize the blemishes that America has. For any number of reasons. Some of it is sometimes people, their own identity is tied up in an institution or an organization, and the critique of that institution or organization feels like a critique of them. Hence the maybe real anxiety, sometimes I think it's a false anxiety, but maybe real anxiety, that an honest conversation about racism in America may make white children feel bad, right? If for conservatives, part of their identity is America is great, and I love being an American because our country is so great, and I teach my kids those values. If we have to navigate a terrain of America has problems, it's always had problems, then those who have a very narrow way of loving it may have some anxiety. In closing, let me say this. Critical race theory is about more than writing books and articles. It's about more than a bunch of or a handful of law professors. It's about an honest critique of America, and it can reverberate to other countries, but it's rooted here, especially in the context of our legal regime. But it's also, as I noted before, it's about activism. It's about writing, but it's about being in a community. It's about teaching, but it's about being in organizations or connected to organizations and institutions that can try to level the playing field for people of color. So that's, how I think we should contemplate CRT, its roots, its history, its tenets, the anxiety that it causes, why that anxiety is unfounded, and let's have a conversation about where we might go from here.
Thank you, Professor Parks, for this really outstanding and thorough analysis of critical race theory, really helping us to understand its intellectual foundations in historic jurisprudence. And we do want to open up the floor for questions, and there is one in the chat. Hold on one second. Let me get the chat. Hold on. Our computer is freezing. Hold on one second. Okay. The question is, if racism isn't going anywhere, what exactly are we fighting for? Or are we just fighting against?
I think we're fighting for our sanity. And I'm a lawyer, but a psychologist. And there was a social psychologist, he was a cognitive psychologist, did a study in which he put a dog in a pen. He had a mat on one side and no mat on the other, and he ran an electric shock through the mat. The dog would jump off the mat onto the side with no mat. And then he'd move the mat to the other side and shock the dog, and the dog would jump back to the other side. Then he'd put two mats in there. Shock one side, the dog would jump to the other side. Shock the dog, would jump back. Shock the dog again. Ultimately, the dog would just lay down. and accept the shock.
Hmm.
And so I think one thing we're fighting for is our psychological well-being. Know that we just haven't rolled over and taken it.
Mm-hmm.
The second would be that while racism will always exist, there are, as the young folks say, there are levels to this, right? At the very least, we're fighting to not go back to where we were several generations ago. And people are fighting to take us back there, right? Undermine our ability to have our vote counted, us get slaughtered in the streets by state actors with no justice. So there are folks who say they want to take their country back. They want to make America great again, imagining some time in decades or generations past where America was a better country. So one is to ensure that our plight isn't as bad as it once was, ensure the gains that our ancestors made for us, and to make as many additional gains as we can. In the discussion of CRT, there's a realization that progress is always followed by retrenchment. Progress always sees individuals who didn't want you to see progress or make it fight to take you back to some prior state. The election of Barack Obama was a momentous occasion, but I think anybody reading the tea leaves would have seen the outrage on the part of some of our fellow countrymen and women would ensure that they would fight tooth and nail even harder to take us back to a prior date and time. Because to them, seeing a black man in the White House and a black woman as the first lady was more than a loss of an election for them. The election of a black woman vice president, momentous occasion. For some in our country, it was a time to storm the nation's capital, declare the election a fraud. The nomination and confirmation of the first black woman Supreme Court justice is a time for celebration. But undoubtedly, there will be those Americans who say, see, we're losing everything we once had. Fight even more doggedly to take this country back to a time that was more palatable to them. So you'll always see this progress and a fight to push back to earlier times. But even as racism will always exist, we can always fight for better days, even if those days aren't going to be perfect days.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think too, as you talk about that in terms of this struggle, this fight, it implies the famous statement W.E.B. Du Bois made in The Souls of Black Folk about, the two-ness, as he talked about the double consciousness. I mean, although we certainly know that, there are far more other intersections than just being Black and American, as Du Bois highlighted in 1903, but being Black and American and how that dealing with that, wrestling with that, there was a certain dogged strength, which I think is symbolic of the struggle. I mean, the fight, and simply to fight, as you said, not to go backward, or to go back to where things were, say, pre-1964, 1965, before the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, which has been gutted for the most part, were enacted. And so I think that is to the point. I read an article that highlighted one of your points that you made toward the end, and that Thomas Edsall wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times today, and he highlighted the very things, the fears that animate the assault or the use of CRT as a bludgeon just a convenient bludgeon to attack, whatever really seeks to get to the root of what the American dilemma is. That is, the American dilemma is Gunnar Myrdal called it in 1944. And so, in light of that, what strategies would you suggest for the everyday person to counter these fictions and fallacies related to CRT? In particular,
no, go ahead. I
Yeah.
don't mean to cut you off.
Oh, that's okay. And the challenge of doing this in a world where QAnon conspiracies and pervasive information is, easily at reach.
One thing we know about voters, that the voters who aren't prone to vote based on emotion or party affiliation are highly informed voters. Problem is, most Americans are low information voters. Either they aren't interested, or they just don't have the time to become sophisticated consumers of policy. And so, one is got to find ways to educate those who are open to being educated. So I have a colleague, friend from when I was in my PhD program at the University of Kentucky, who's white, husband's white, white kids, but they have a library, free library of books on issues of race in their front yard. I'm trying to look it up right now. Oh, the Anti-Racist Library. They've got an Instagram page, Anti-Racist Library 20. And, they share what books they've recently got, and folks come around and pick them up and they read them, and some folks drop off other books. My only concern is maybe you're preaching to the choir. These are already folks who have anti-racist tendencies, and they're just trying to educate themselves and their children even more. The real question is, how do you communicate to Fox News viewers? One of the things that helps erode racial bias is meaningful intergroup contact. So, to the extent that folks of goodwill who are anti-racist, or at least not racist, want to make inroads, you got to find ways to meaningfully engage with folks on the other side of the aisle and have meaningful conversations with them about what the truth is. For example, I'm a progressive Democrat, but I love my guns and I do a lot of martial arts. I'm usually around in those spaces a lot of conservatives. And on the gun side, at least those who work in the spaces I go, they're more concerned with green than they are about black or white. But given that they're not trying to offend the customer, gives us an opportunity to have honest conversations. In the martial arts space, we see each other so regularly that it may give us a chance to have honest conversations. The challenge, though, is in psychology, there's a concept called motivated reasoning. And you see it most pronounced in politics. And what it means is an individual is emotionally motivated to achieve a certain outcome. And because of that, maybe consciously, but often subconsciously, they're more likely to look for and select information that supports what they believe and ignore or downplay information that would undermine what they believe.
Yeah.
When a person's in such a posture, it is difficult to turn them around unless they see themselves as and want to be the kind of person who is a rational thinker. So that might be a lead-in. Do you want to be a rational thinker? We may disagree on some stuff, but can we have an honest conversation? The bar may be higher, clear, for them to believe the truth than the average person. The question is, do you have the patience and the energy to work them to the point of clearing that bar? So that's what I think it's going to take, which is a lot of energy on the part of an individual person. But do you want to invest that amount of energy in your fellow citizens?
You've kind of talked about it throughout, or at least implied it, but what is at stake in your view for this nation as a democracy, a democratic republic, in this public discourse around CRT?
Oh, it's the end of democracy. I think that there are factions in this country that have been chipping away. That one, I've never wanted democracy. And the more democratic the society has become, the harder they've fought to take it back to anti-democratic principles. And like I said, the election of, I'd even say going back to, Jimmy Carter and his sympathies for people of color, Bill Clinton as the first Black president. Even though he's white, he had too close ties with the Black community for some folks' comfort. We know that with the advance of issues like affirmative action, you saw a significant erosion of working class whites from the Democratic Party. And their rationale for fleeing the Democratic Party was they saw it as a party of Black people. The Democrats were catering too much to them, to us, Black folks, and not to foreign working class whites. And Republicans had a Trump-type game plan for how to woo those whites with racially dog whistle politics. And then certainly the election of Barack Obama and Joe Biden, well, with Kamala Harris in the background, and Donald Trump certainly complicates that. And certainly Ketanji Brown Jackson. So, clearly there's an effort afoot on the political right to, ironically, if we take it back to one of the tenets of CRT, though race has no biological basis, it has psychological purchase. And it has so much purchase that folks who describe themselves as freedom-loving individuals who believe in democracy will destroy democracy for something they hold more sacrosanct. That's whiteness. There's a paper titled Whiteness as Property that we read in class, written by Cheryl Harris, law professor at UCLA. And she argues in this piece that the Harvard Law Review article, that whiteness has properties of actual property. And the same way an individual would defend their land or their house because it has value to them, some whites will fight tooth and nail to protect the benefits that whiteness bestows, even if that means destroying the republic, and even if it means having a dictator in office. So, I think most folks know we're at a precarious point in our history as a country, and the core issue being, will democracy survive? And the CRT as a component here is just a way to create a wedge to scare white people, to ensure that white children don't have a more fulsome understanding of the beauty and the blemishes associated with America. Because if they knew that, there's a chance that, not that they feel bad, but that they may grow up to want to make this a more perfect union. And there's some folks who don't want it to be a more perfect union, just want power.
Yes, well, I think on that note, we will close. And I really want to thank you for being with us, Professor Parks, and taking us through just a superb sort of excursion through critical race theory in terms of its foundations and its current application, also hitting on, a number of key issues that help us, I think, to more clearly understand how the dynamics of racism work and what are the psychological and other underpinnings of it, but also to how the struggle and the effort to confront it and to reject it continues and still is necessary in this age, despite the permanence of racism, as Derek Bell talked about it. So thank you so much for taking us through this journey. And thank all of you who participated and came to tonight's conversation. We hope you have a good evening. I hope that you will leave enriched by this conversation. Thank you again, and have a